Hello, MCAC English Ministry. My name is Regan, and I'm coming to you today from Caledonia, Ontario, recording at my home church, Gateway Church, where our family attends and my wife is our worship pastor. Now, I love where we live, and if you don't know where Caledonia is, it's not north of you, west of Brampton. That would be Caledon. Caledonia is located right between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, 30 minutes from either shore, along the Grand River south of Hamilton. And a shout out to Pastor Randolph, who also lives in Hamilton, as well as Calvin Lamb, one of our new venture leaders who MCAC partners with. So thank you for that. Randolph and Calvin would be able to tell you how different Hamilton and Caledonia are. But I love that I can live in a place like Caledonia, but visit Hamilton or other cities like it in the GTA. Now, I'm an extrovert. I love being around people, and I'll talk to just about anyone. I also love experiencing the kaleidoscope of cultures in a city, especially different foods. During COVID, when we can't physically travel, our family has been trying to travel the world through our takeout. Maybe some of you have been doing this. My wife even has this Hamilton food bingo card. And in addition to food, I love music, art, theater, unique architecture, museums, all the things that you can find plenty of in the city. And actually, before moving to Caledonia in 2008, I actually took a job at Gateway Church, first for me as the youth pastor, and my wife and I, pre-kids, lived in Markham before that, and both worked at Unionville Alliance Church. And at that point, living in the suburbs, we spent the most of our free time in downtown Toronto and thought we would actually end up moving down there someday. But God had different plans. And if you think Caledonia and Hamilton are different, that divide increases when you think of Toronto and Caledonia. And I found myself encountering a strong emotional response to the city, but when I got here, in the opposite direction. When I said the city, people meant Hamilton, not Toronto, as I was accustomed to. And the reason why people lived in Caledonia was that it was not Hamilton. Unlike me, who said, whew, I can move to a small town like Caledonia because it's so close to Hamilton. Now, I'd say for the first 7 or 8 years of living here, I still thought this. I love Caledonia because of what it's close to, not necessarily for its own identity and uniqueness. The church that I worked with and now still attend is just on the outskirts of Caledonia, right when you come into town from the 403 and Highway 6. And we were technically in Caledonia, but people attend and are involved from a 45-minute radius, very much like MCAC. We gathered in a specific location, but we're a people who were quite scattered throughout a large geographic region, living in one place and serving and worshiping in another. Now, at this time, Dan Martin and I from Bramley Alliance, who spoke a few weeks ago actually here with you, were the co-directors of CCD Youth. And for 4 years, partnering and collaborating with churches and youth ministries across the Central Canadian District. So with one hat, I held a 45-minute driving radius of responsibility. And when I put on the other, 18 hours of driving distance from Windsor to Thunder Bay. I loved both of these jobs. And my friend and former coworker Jen Thompson used to add the hashtag #BestJobEver to everything we shared. I also know that we need more and more specialized lifelong youth workers than ever. And I thought I was actually going to be one of them, an 80-year-old youth worker. But despite the fun and passion in my work, I started to notice this disconnect between my vocational ministry and the life of ministry that Jesus was inviting me into. Now, with these growing circles of influence and responsibility, I became more and more disconnected from the place I lived, even though I loved it. And the more energy was being poured into my role as pastor, less and less to being a husband, a father, a brother, a son, a neighbor, a community member, and a friend. One phrase that I'd been saying for years and years was this: I live a life of ministry, I just happen to get paid for part of it. And it looked like in this moment that my heart was finally catching up with these words. It was once a life of ministry anywhere from 45 minutes to 18 hours from my house. These circles of responsibility in my heart became smaller and smaller and smaller as I was more and more passionate about the 10 steps from my house with my family and my neighbors to a maximum of a 20-minute bike ride to the other end of town. Now, very early on in moving to Caledonia, my wife and I had a dream of starting a community space to bring light and life in a unique way, and it would meet the in-between needs that were not being met by those existing churches in town and other organizations that existed. So with an increased love and passion for my community, I actually first stepped down from the CCD youth role in May of 2017. And then following that, I wrapped up as youth pastor at Gateway and started a new role with New Ventures, focusing on development of new venture leaders and helping to start new ministries and churches, to create and shape multiplicative movements. A huge part of my job is discerning pathways for people in churches in the new things that Jesus is inviting them into. Now you might be thinking, Regan, I thought you wanted to focus more and more on Caledonia. The truth is I did. And my thought was this: I was just a local church youth pastor and helped other youth pastors and ministries at the same time. So how about I do the same thing here in Caledonia with New Ventures, and I'll explore something new while also supporting others who are doing the same. It actually seems to be what I was made to do. This is how I can love God and love others well. This is what I thought. So quickly, I found out that this was not the case. And with months, I discovered that it wasn't the right timing for our family. And with my wife's increasing responsibilities as a staff member at Gateway, what we dreamed about all those years was turning into not an us thing or even a God thing, but a me thing. And a few months after putting this idea aside and only focusing on one job, I was driving up to Owen Sound to meet with one of our new venture leaders, Greg Musselman. And he had just started a new venture called The Exchange in Owen Sound. And this was a storefront space with apartments above and a ministry space down below. And their mission was to disciple through practical needs and to be a resource to churches and the community in Owen Sound. Now, on the halfway mark of my 3-hour drive, as I was mentally preparing for my time with Greg, I started to notice jealousy and resentment started to rise up. And I remember asking God this: why does Greg get to do this? You know, Linz and I have dreamed about starting up a ministry space like this in Caledonia. Why does he get to do it and I don't? Now, despite my little tantrum with God, I immediately felt a calmness in my spirit start to combat these emotions, and I heard God say, why did you leave your work with Gateway and CCD Youth? Well, so I could be more engaged in my community with those closest to me. And then God said, and how is that going? Well, I'm more involved than ever with my family, with my neighbors, volunteering at my kids' school, and at the high school with the drama club. And do you need a building or a ministry to lead to do those things? No. And I call this the drop kick to the head that kick-started my heart. Here's what God said. What if I never asked you to start something like Greg, but to just help others like him? Now, I didn't respond like this then, but if I was writing a book or a screenplay for a movie, I would write this as my response about what I get to do right now. Best job ever. My one and only goal is to help people and the churches I am working with to pursue clarity and to be faithful to how Jesus is inviting them to partner with him in the new things he's doing. And these things are in the places and spaces that they're already in or where he's calling them to. And whether I'm talking to one of our new venture leaders or apprentices or a neighbor or a friend, this is my goal: to follow Jesus's lead. This is how I want to authentically love God and love others well. I love how Aaron Gerard, one of our former new venture leaders, he describes an experience he had after coming to the end of himself and how Jesus brought his head and heart to a new place, which allowed him to see the place he was in a new way. He says this in his book, Quit Pastoring Your Church. He says, I have been a Christian for decades. I celebrate Easter. I believe Jesus died and rose again. I believe that through the power of the Spirit, Jesus speaks even today. I believe he can do signs and wonders. But what I realized in that moment was that I did not functionally believe those things. I believed them on paper, even in my heart, but I did not believe them in real life. Until that moment, I believed that my skills as a leader could carry me well enough. But on that day, up against the wall, I came to the end of that belief. I realized for the first time that I needed Jesus. I needed him, not just the idea of him, but him. I needed his voice. I needed his healing. I needed his leadership. And I became convinced that if our church, and I will add to this quote, any church has any sort of positive future, we need him just as much in all the same ways. And now I'm convinced that as the church in Canada, we need to think more and more about the places that God has us in, and the new places our minds and our hearts may have to go in order to partner with Jesus in the new things he is doing. And the deeper we go in him, the further he will take us, and the more effective we will be at sharing Jesus' love with those around us. MCAC, this is the heartbeat of our movement as the Alliance Church in Canada. But more importantly, it's our call as the Big C Church, the universal historic body of Christ. Friends, the places we go and the spaces we occupy matter. Why? Because we are made in the image of God. We are to follow his lead as creator and father to all creation, to follow Jesus' lead as the incarnate presence in all things. And then also we welcome the Spirit's help, who continues to point us to the presence and reconciling work of Jesus in our own lives and in the places we live, play, and work. Now in another book, No Home-Like Place, Leonard Marlson says this: God cannot be pinned down to a particular place, but is particular in places as God chooses to make himself known. God in Christ is making all things new, and we meet God in particular places. And to partner with Jesus in those places, we need to follow the greatest commandment: to love God and love others. But to do this can't just be a slogan or a mantra we repeat or a hashtag we use or a t-shirt we wear. This must be lived out in place, embodied. Jesus says in Mark 12 and Matthew 22, the most important one is, Israel, listen. Our God is the one Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being or soul, and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: you will love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. And I'm going to be using the Common English Bible today for our text, so that may have sounded a little bit different to you, but just wanted to give you a heads up with that. Now, the end of that verse also, Jesus ends with these words: all the law and prophets depend on these two commands. And when Jesus identified loving God and loving others as the greatest commandment, this wasn't anything new or groundbreaking for his listeners. He was actually quoting part of the Shema, one of the most famous Jewish prayers found in Deuteronomy 6. And then he tied a little Levitical law in it to round it all out. And when Jesus says, love God and love others, we have to know that this is not disconnected from the places we occupy. And as Leonard Marlson goes on to say, he says the land and theology of place doesn't drop out of the picture in favor of spiritual salvation and inward relationship to God. People and place remain at the center of God's purposes. Loving God and others isn't simply a belief or a state of mind. We need to see the places around us as partners in redemptive work with Jesus. And we need to refrain from the temptation of seeing our neighborhoods as something to consume and serve our needs rather than places to serve and invest. The command to love our neighbors is as much an invitation to freedom and joy for ourselves as it is for bringing life to the neighborhoods where we live. And in Deuteronomy 6, the topic of the land shows up 7 times surrounding the Shema, the Jewish profession of faith that we see there. Now, this prayer was intended to be a guide and be a foundation for every action and every moment of life. Listen to these words. Listen, our God is the Lord, only the Lord. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your being, and all your strength. And when we read these words in this prayer and repeat it, just as Jesus and the gospel writers did, we need to remember that as God's initial chosen people, the Israelites, the covenant between him involved the land. It involved place and presence. Now you might be thinking, why are we talking about place right now during a pandemic? Couldn't this have waited until we kind of figured this all over? I mean, Our geographic footprint has never been so small. Our relational buckets are running on empty from Zoom calls, getting takeout, and short porch visits. But like the Israelites, wandering in the desert for 40 years, preparing to enter the promised land, could it be that there is purpose to the places we currently find ourselves in, as individuals, as churches, and as a society, pointing us to the presence of God now and preparing us for what is to come? Now, there's a ton that we can learn from this new generation of Israelites that Moses is addressing in Deuteronomy. And in this third wave of the pandemic and current state of lockdown, we too are in waiting. And we're preparing for a new land, a new way of being. And how we love God and love others in the waiting and practice placemaking and engage with others now will affect our future. God's presence will never leave us, but there will be fruit or consequences of how we navigate the season of transition that we're in. Moses knows firsthand the consequence of disobedience. After being told that he would not be entering the promised land, Moses reminds the Israelites, be on your guard and watch yourselves closely so that you don't forget the things your eyes saw, and so they never leave your mind as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to your grandchildren. This is Deuteronomy 4:9. Now, the text doesn't say this specifically, but considering the conversation Moses just had with God before this is not just a message that Moses is relaying. I imagine it coming from a deep place of grief and loss for him. Israel, don't lose sight like I did. Be on your guard. Watch yourselves closely. If I can mess up, Moses, a prophet of God, one who has spoken to him like a friend, there is definitely no power, position of authority, or privilege as a people that will protect you. And as we think about placemaking, it's not just about the physical places we are or will occupy, or the people in those places and the relational space that has been developed, but rather placemaking begins with a particular way of seeing. This is a faithful attentiveness that puts God at the center of everything. And Mark Sayers, in his book, Disappearing Church, he says this: the people of the church need to see themselves clearly. They need to see their neighbors, this historical moment, and this moment's place amid the inbreaking kingdom. And thinking about our historical moment that we're in, this pandemic, I was lovingly convicted by God to see something in myself that was affecting my ability to love God and love others, and to be faithfully present to the places I was. By mid-October, between working at home and virtual school, my wife and I had a great routine down. And I actually thanked God for how he was helping us manage everything and get through it all. But what God knew in my heart that I didn't know until he pointed out to me was this: I was treating him more like a personal assistant than the Lord of the universe. And what started with me following God's lead and asking him about the plans that he had for us and what he knew was best for us as a good father, my heart started to shift and to see him as an accessory to our plans, not the one that was preparing our way. I can remember when people would ask how our family was doing, I would say things like, oh yeah, Linz and I have a really good system down. We're so thankful to God for it. But the truth is, I was giving lip service to God, and my heart towards God was starting to shift. My everything, my practices, my perspectives were reflecting how I was viewing God. And what started as good intentions, to trust God with all my heart, with all my strength, and with all my being, slowly turned into managing the day-to-day challenges that came my way and celebrating the resiliency that I had to make it through this storm. Now, thankfully, God didn't let my heart go down this path for very long, and he helped me to see what was truly going on. And in a time of prayer, I started the conversation like I did repeatedly in this season. God, thank you for all that you've given us to get through this pandemic. And in that moment, I felt a pause in my spirit, and I sensed these words from God. You're right, Regan. I have been helping you get through this. But instead of simply praying for you and your family to get through the pandemic, why haven't you been praying for COVID to be gone? For good? Now, God could have said, All I've given you, Regan? Oh, well, from what you've been telling others, it sounds like you've got a good thing going all on your own. Doesn't look like you really need me. But God didn't do this. He didn't point out what I'd been saying to others. He simply asked me a question to help me see. And immediately in this moment, the Holy Spirit revealed to me how I was not worshiping God or trusting him as the Lord and King of all the universe, the sovereign God over heaven and earth, who has ultimate power, wisdom, and authority. Like when the Israelites first heard these words, Israel, listen, the Lord is one, only the Lord, the one who orders and controls all things according to his own eternal purpose. And even when the effects of sin, sickness, death, brokenness are evident in our world, whether we're experiencing those personally or collectively, nothing can separate us from God's love, and his plans and purposes for us are always possible. And he can take any terrible situation, redeem it, reconcile it, and even create good out of evil. And like the Israelites who were encouraged to look into the days gone past, as it says in chapter 4:32, God reminded them to see his inbreaking kingdom and to be faithfully attentive to his presence. And we too need to be reminded of that, of all that God has done, is doing, and will do. Scriptures also say, now look into it, all the way back to the day God first created human beings on earth, from the one end of heaven to the other. Has anything like this amazing ever happened? Has anything like it ever been heard before? And to the Israelites, then God points out all the ways that he was particular in specific places in making himself known to his people, speaking through the fire, with a strong outstretched arm, removing them from Egypt. They were shown these things so that they would know this: the Lord is the only God. There's no other God except him. Know then today and keep in mind that the Lord is the only God in heaven above or on earth below. There is no other. Now, as you think about this past year or the years prior to it, what has God been pointing out to you about where you currently find yourself? In the spaces and places that you occupy, how has God been revealing himself to you and those around you? Well, the first thing in placemaking is seeing. But before pointing out the second, I'd like to make this point. Valuing place means valuing people in places while rediscovering the mission of God. But placemaking doesn't just happen in our neighborhoods or in our postal codes. Now, like my church, Gateway, MCAC is a regional church, and you have multiple congregations who meet, but your people are spread out across a large geographic region. Many of you don't worship and attend church in your neighborhood, and in the GTA, many of you don't even live in the same neighborhood that you work. And outside geography, what about the relational spaces we occupy? How many of our friends and family actually live in the neighborhood that we live in? And what about those friendships that we have that just solely exist online? Or what about all the family and friends that we have in other parts of the world? With all this distance and fragmentation to the places we connect in, placemaking might actually seem overwhelming. How, God, can I see and listen and be attentive to all these different places? Well, I don't have his book here, but I have the e-copy, and Rohadi Nagasar, a pastor, speaker, and author from Calgary, he points this out in his book, Thrive. He says, many do not live and work in the same neighborhood, as we just pointed out. For this reason, I chase presence over place. Presence retains the elements of incarnation and value of local neighborhood, but it includes where you're connected relationally, even if it's not where you live. And yes, placemaking is about being faithfully present and to see the potential and possibility in these spaces that are waiting to be opened to the kingdom. But how does God do this? How does he open these places? Well, it's through a faithful people, far from perfect, but who are already attentive to God's presence and his perfection. Another author, David Fitch, who's another Canadian but ministering in the States, he writes that seeing and being faithfully attentive and present to his presence is the starting point for changing the world. But we just can't stop there. To follow Jesus' lead and to become spirit-empowered placemakers, we need to listen. This is the second thing about placemaking. And in Deuteronomy 6:4, God says, Israel, listen. And Tim Mackey from Bible Project, he makes the point that this opening line does not simply mean to just let the sound waves enter your ears. But this word, listen, means to allow the words to sink in, provide understanding, and to generate a response. And if seeing is being faithfully attentive, then hearing or listening is all about faithful obedience, responding to God's love and love him and others in return. And when we experience God and express our love and devotion to him and to others with our whole being, this is true listening, loving God and others with our hearts, soul, and strength. And this shows up in our thoughts, in our words, and our actions. And listening is embedding our faith and beliefs into practice, into place. Listen to these words that Moses gave the Israelites and that the Spirit continues to give us today through his scriptures. Make the things I'm commanding you today part of who you are. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you're sitting together in your home and when you're walking together down the road. Make them the last thing you talk about before you go to bed and the first thing you talk about the next morning. We can't be passive in our placemaking. And when we are witnesses to the work and love of God, it leads us to act, to follow. To be faithfully present means we are listening, responding, and being obedient to the places and spaces God has us in. Authentic placemaking is not just about awareness, but rather it helps us rediscover the mission of God. Now, in New Ventures, we have two ways that we try to foster these types of environments where individuals and groups can practice seeing and listening. For individuals, we have New Venture apprenticeships. And for groups, we have what are called discerning communities. Now, apprenticeships are for those who are in season of development, in discernment, or in transition. And they're given a year or two to pursue clarity through the following three questions. Number one, who is God calling me to be? Number two, where and to whom? And number three, what is he actually asking me to do? Now, right now in the CCD, we have 8 apprentices. We have Paul and Paige Lucas in Acton, and they're partnering with Crossings Church. We have Reese Plant, who is exploring planting a church with West London in the Chelsea Green neighborhood of London. We have Jenny Johnson, who's a part of the Manor Ministries, the New Venture in Guelph. And we have Christina McBean, a former staff member of Vox Alliance in Barrie, who has moved to Huntsville, has bought some property, and is learning and listening to God and following his heart to help and disciple people who've been affected by sexual abuse. And lastly, we have Zach and Vanessa Hare just south of you in Port Credit, who are also a part of our Lakeshore Discerning Community, which operates there as well. And this community focuses on a 12-kilometer stretch of neighborhoods south of the QEW and stretches across the Gardiner from Port Credit to New Toronto. Now, we have 4 discerning communities right now in the CCD, with 2 of them not so far away from you. Lakeshore, what I just mentioned, and Georgetown to the north. And like the Lakeshore group, these groups are all about listening and learning as they focus on a geographic region, a demographic, or a people group, while seeking clarity through the Spirit through the following 2 questions. Number 1, Jesus, how are you currently at work? And number 2, how are you inviting us to partner with you in this place or with these people? You don't have to be an apprentice or part of an organized discernment group like this to listen well. Anyone can seek God with these questions. However, what we do see is that we do need to be intentional. We need to follow Jesus' lead. We need to make a choice. This won't happen on its own. We need to make this choice individually. We need to make it together. We need to make it as a community, as our churches, and as the body of Christ. Now, one of my favorite books that has helped me personally with placemaking and also helped me with coaching and encouraging others is The New Parish by the Parish Collective. Just a helpful bit of trivia from today's message. I've used as many Canadian speakers and authors that I could. Aaron Gerard, Rohati, Preston Pateau, Leonard Marlson. And this book is written from an American context, which we won't hold that against them. But they do have a Canadian on their writing team, and his name is Dwight J. Friesen. Anyways, listen to what Friesen and his writing partners have to say about listening well. Follow Jesus into your neighborhood with fellow followers of Jesus. Allow the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ to form your imagination for faithful presence. We need to be listeners, integrators, and relational bridge builders, drawn together for mutual listening, discerning, and experimenting, but not fixing. I could point out to you examples of what this looks like in Scripture, or I could share countless examples from our new ventures, not only in the CCD, but across Canada. But I thought I'd share a story a little closer to home for you as a church, seeing, listening, following Jesus' lead, and practicing placemaking. And what church is this? Well, it's actually you guys, MCAC English Ministry. A few weeks ago, I was talking to your very own pastor, John Ma, and he told me something that you tried to do to practice placemaking. Now, maybe you didn't know this term or you didn't use it or it's the first time that this has been connected for you, but you tried to practice placemaking through the Easter fun buns. This term, Easter fun buns, makes me smile every time I read it or say it. And it's really fun to say, so kudos to whoever chose that term. But my heart is full. Why this makes me smile is because I think about the ways that you were intentional, the ways that you were intentional about seeing the presence of God in your communities and in your relationships. Also, how well you listened and heard that call and obeyed to step out and be relational bridge builders, inspired, empowered by the love of Jesus. I want to send a huge shout out to Priscilla from Communications and Stephanie. I scrolled through all the videos and the posts on social media, and the vision for this experiment was so clearly communicated. And the ways you presented the Easter story, the ways you used the tradition of the bun and walked through everything step by step, it was unbelievable. Now, the two of you and all those from MCAC who participated, you were following Jesus' lead. You were seeing where he was at work and listening and obeying along the way. What an amazing example of practicing placemaking and being faithfully attentive to God's presence. In the new parish, the authors write this: if ever there was a time to experiment your way into a fresh, contextual expression of the church, this is it. Because experiments of faithful and communal presence are the best way to truly learn how to be in the church in everyday life. You'll have to take some careful but brave steps of faith if you're going to discern your way into the future. So, MCAC, what's next? What does that future look like for you? Well, only God knows. And to wrap this part of the service together, you don't need to hear any more from me. Let's actually spend some time listening and talking to God about following Jesus' lead and practicing placemaking with him. Now, if you need a few questions or conversation starters, here's a few things that you can ask Jesus. When I think of my neighborhood, what do I see? When I think of myself in my home or on my street or in my workplace, what do I see? Or how about this? Like the Israelites getting ready to move into the promised land, how is God challenging us individually as followers of Jesus, as a people, the church, to love God and others in this specific time and place? What is he showing us? As you continue to see, listen, and be faithfully attentive to God's presence in your midst, how is he inviting you to deeper and further placemaking with him?